Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Allison Bainbridge, and I am a host at Book Passage. Good afternoon to those of you on the West Coast, and good evening to those of you who are joining us from the East Coast, and thank you so much. I am honored to welcome you to Book Passage's third annual panel discussion on race in America. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Just when we think and feel like we are progressing beyond racism and hatred, an event or events occur that could potentially shatter our hope and optimism. We debate whether there are more acts being committed, or is it that they are more visible with the advent of social media? 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I am a 60-year-old Jewish woman. I have experienced anti-Semitism and misogyny, yet I walk the streets when it is light out without fearing for my life. I do not know, and I will never know, the fear of being judged or hated for the color of my skin. My daughter, who works at the United Nations, forwarded a powerful speech to me the other day. It was delivered on March 19th by Linda Thomas Greenfield, the newly appointed UN ambassador and the granddaughter of a woman born in slavery. In her words, she points out that racism is the problem of the racist. It is not the problem of the person who experiences it. It is the problem of the society that produces the racist, and we must face it down every time, no matter whom it's directed towards. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It is with pride and affection that I introduce my friend and colleague, Paula Farmer. In addition to being a buyer and event host for Book Passage, she's been curating special panel events that focus on timely social and political issues such as race, immigration, the Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and a Toni Morrison tribute event. Since the pandemic, she's launched the Speaking Of interview series on Instagram, where she talks to authors, artists, and activists on topical issues, which if you haven't tuned in, I highly recommend it. They're wonderful. For the past couple of years, Paula served as the chairperson of the Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee for the California Independent Booksellers Association, and she was recently selected as a board member of the DEI Committee for the American Booksellers Association. Congratulations, Paula. So it is all yours.
Thank you, Allison, and not only for your generous introduction, but for all your input and support as I was developing this event. Thanks also to Karen, Calvin of Kaliba, and Kathy for prep help, Kayla and Michael for marketing assistance, and to Zach and Nick, who are behind the scenes as we speak, helping us with tech support. Of course, I wouldn't even be doing this if it were not for the local Book Passage community, which started these events live and in person. But for now, we have to go virtual and global, which can be a positive thing. And I want to say welcome to all of those joining us live, wherever you are in the world, and for those who will be watching this later in the recorded version. We appreciate it. In the aftermath of Donald Trump's presidency, which was riddled with racist rhetoric and anti-immigrant legislation, we are still whirling from that, as well as a year-long pandemic and the disproportionate impact it had on Black and Brown communities, along with the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests. Although we have a new administration, there's clearly much that still needs to be done, reckoned with. We will look at that today, talk about past mistakes, lessons learned, and work ahead. One of the panelists, which you'll be meeting in just a second, mainly Chai, we had a conversation 2 months ago when I first asked her to come onto this panel. And at the time, we thought it would be kind of a lighter panel and maybe celebratory in light of Trump being out of office. But 2 months later, and here we are, the residual effects of Trump and the continued effects of racism in America persist. In just the last couple of months, we've seen assault on our democracy through the election process, assault on our Capitol building, and an increasing assault in Asian communities. And now we're even seeing more assault on our electoral process and the rise of voter suppression once again. It is because of that last thing that I have chosen Fair Fight as the recipient for our fundraising effort today. So please notice in the YouTube channel that you can donate to Fair Fight throughout our talk, also in the recordings, and even afterwards. Just go to fairfight.com, where they fight for fair and free elections. And this is important now more than ever. As Allison mentioned, this is the third Race in America panel, the fourth if you considered that we did have a Racism in America panel last June. And this, though, is the first one that we're having in March as opposed to February. And because March is Women's History Month, I decided to honor that and have an all-female panel. And I'm so glad I've rounded up the women that I have. They're all dynamic, they're fierce, they're fearless, they're intelligent. And I think they all will bring something very unique to this conversation. First of all, I want to introduce, and this is only in alphabetical order, Myriam Gerba. She is the author of 10 books, including the collection of short stories, Useful Phrase for Immigrants, and 3 novels. Myriam is a writer and is the recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. The Literature Award. She is Associate Professor of Creative Writing at the Writing Department at SF State University. She just this last week had an op-ed in the LA Times entitled "How Asian Women Are Relentlessly Objectified in American Culture." If you haven't read it, I highly, highly recommend it. Next up is Miriam Gerba. She is a writer, storyteller, and visual artist. She is best known for her review in Tropics of Meta of American Dirt, the novel American Dirt, in 2019. The Oprah magazine called Gurba's work Mean, which is right up here behind me, one of the best LGBTQ books of all time. Mean is a true crime memoir and ghost story, as well as the bold and hilarious tale of Miriam Gerba's coming of age as a queer mixed race Chicana, blending radical formal fluidity and caustic humor. Next up is Nia McAllister. And Nia, you might want to wave your hand so we know who everybody is. Nia is a Bay Area born and raised poet, writer, environmental justice advocate, and museum professional. As the public programs manager for the Museum of African Diaspora, San Francisco. Having received a degree in environmental analysis, race, class, gender, and the environment, she has dedicated herself to facilitating engaging and impactful experiences at the intersection of art, writing, and activism. Last but not least is Melody Moisey. Wave your hand, Melody. She is an Iranian American Muslim author, attorney, activist, and visiting associate professor of creative writing at UNCW. She is the author of War on Error, Real Stories of American Muslims, and most recently, The Rumi Prescription, How an Ancient Mystic Poet Changed My Modern Manic Life. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and many other outlets. So thank you, ladies. Thank you so much for being a part of this panel. As we begin, I'd like to remind our panel, as well as the audience, especially the audience, that this is a platform for respectful discourse and civil discourse. It is a safe place. We will start off with my question and the panelists' answers and discussions, but there will be a time at the end for the audience to submit questions and comments, and we will definitely get to a few of them. So to start, as I mentioned, we're doing this during Women's History Month, and I thought it would be nice just for each panelist to briefly tell us who their role model is, who inspires them, who influenced them to be the leaders that they are. And take it away, Myriam.
Thank you so much, Paula. I really appreciate you organizing this, and especially on this week where we have been mourning across America the murder of the 8 people from a white domestic terrorist in Georgia. My beyond my grandmother Maya and Zhao Chai, my role model was, of course, Maxine Hong Kingston. Was a fierce woman warrior, as a writer, as a peace activist, and as someone who really works intersectionally with many communities to fight for justice. And I want to also remind people this isn't new, right? We've been doing this work for generations. You know, we've got fierce women within our families and within our communities. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Melody, who's yours?
So Paula sent us this earlier and said it can't be your mom, but my mom is pretty fucking amazing.
No. Just in fairness, I said let's.
I'm breaking the rule. No, my mom is pretty fucking amazing. She's a doctor. She saved my life. Apart from giving birth to me, I had a weird pancreatic tumor that happens in adolescent Japanese girls, and my mom knew what that looked like. And when my doctors came and told my parents that I had pancreatic cancer, my mom said, no, this is that rare tumor, because she is amazing and has a photographic memory, and she saved my life because they would have killed me otherwise. So I'm going with my mom.
That's absolutely fine. Myriam?
I'm gonna go ahead and sort of defy the rule as well, and say that one of my inspirations was my maternal grandmother. She was an artist, and she played a pretty big role in my upbringing. She was from Mexico, but she would come to the United States, and she helped to raise me. And we would make art together. That's what we did in order to bond. And so art making was never anything like esoteric or far away or strange to me. It became like it was a very familiar practice for me, because it was a kin practice that I did with an elder. And so I would credit my grandmother. And then I'm an atheist, but I was raised within Catholicism. And one of the things that I do appreciate about the Catholic upbringing that I had was that there were a lot of effigies representing feminine divinity and the feminine divine in the form of like various virgins and saints. And I loved those representations, in particular the aggressive ones. And so those Catholic examples of the feminine divine were incredibly inspirational to me.
And you, Nia, do you have something special?
I think for me, I always find, inspiration and hope in our literary ancestors. And so for me specifically, Toni Morrison has always been an anchor. I think spending time reading through all of her books, really seeing myself and seeing family and ancestry in her storytelling, and also just how she carried herself and constantly advocated for the importance of taking up space with your stories, specifically as a Black woman, and being steadfast in that. And I think that is something that keeps me going as a writer, and something I look to.
That's great. All of those are great. And even the ones breaking the rules, I totally, it's more important to be authentic. So now let's get into kind of the meat of our panel discussion. And I'm going to start maybe kind of for obvious reasons with Mei Li. I want to start with you because of the recent horrific shooting spree that took place last week in Georgia, in which the gunman targeted Asian-owned spaces, killing 8 people, 6 of which were women. Since the crime, there has been some controversy regarding exactly what type of crime it is or was, whether or not it elevates to a hate crime. And the fact that that's even a question is understandably raises concerns and anger in the Asian community, and questions racism, within the legal system. Please, can you kind of talk to that?
Sure. I mean, this is the injury on top of injury that has been so infuriating on top of the grief, the fact that a white domestic terrorist goes to 3 different clearly marked Asian-owned businesses in a row. He has to drive from one to the next. So it's not, it's not a crime of convenience, right? He had to plan this out, and then targets 6 Asian women for death. And then the media come out and say, and well, first it was the sheriff's department spokesperson in Georgia who announced that they couldn't say that this was racially motivated yet because the gunman, the killer, had said that it wasn't. So first we take his word for that, and then over all else, over the evidence of the dead women's bodies. And then 2, he said, the killer was having a bad day, and this is what he did. And the fact that the law enforcement shows empathy for the murderer, more empathy than for the victims, and certainly more understanding than what it means to a community to be targeted in this way was horrifying, and was like a knife in the heart of, I'm sure every thinking person in the United States, but certainly for the Asian American community. And I've seen this week, just everyone I know, the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State, all the Asian American women writers and activists that I know spring into action and nonstop be pushing back against this false narrative and trying to explain, okay, we're going to use our tools. This is what we do. We're going to explain why this is racially motivated. So this is where my Los Angeles Times piece came from, to explain that no, as Asian women in the United States, we are hypersexualized. Our bodies are constantly commodified. And this has been true since 1875, the Page Act, which banned Chinese women from immigrating to the United States on the suspicion that they were all going to be prostitutes. First of all, there were prostitutes in America to begin with. So why Asian women are targeted for this exclusion is fascinating. And to the assumption that no one can have just, a mother or a wife or a daughter, but could only be sponsoring, a sex worker is fascinating as well. And it shows our deep misogyny in this country. And then also, of course, the antagonism we have towards sex workers. So it's always intersectional. It's always about who is devalued. A white killer is valued, his emotions and empathy. Even today, the New York Times was sending out an article saying how evangelical churches recognized this, this feeling. Let me see if I can find the exact quote. Because it was so shocking, yet again, that a mainstream media would say, the sexual anguish of Atlanta suspect is familiar thorn for evangelicals. Really? This is a thorn for evangelicals? Because I'm telling you, for Asian American women, this sucks. This is more than a thorn. Sounds like a death sentence. So this is what has been so very painful. And I feel like we don't have a reckoning yet in America on this long, long history of institutionalized racism. And even our media, you'd think, after 4 years of accommodating Trump's racist rhetoric and his xenophobia and his misogyny, you would think that they got some kind of clue, right? Even on January 6th with the sedition action, they should have a clue that words matter and have consequences that can hurt all of us. And then today, we still see this from a mainstream media publication. It's so very alarming.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback on what you touched on, as far as the massive increase in crimes and violence and hatred towards Asian Americans just within the last year. I want to say they recorded like about 4,000 incidents, nearly 4,000. That's incredible. Is there any doubt in your mind that this was a kind of spurred on by the last president and his rhetoric?
we know that it was spurred on because in many of the criminal instances, for example, in Texas, in a Sands Club, a white man went up and stabbed 3 Burmese Americans, including 2 children, and said because they were spreading the China virus, right? So we know that it was inspired by Trump's rhetoric. But even without that, whenever there's an incident between tensions between the United States and any country in Asia, we Asian Americans get beaten up or get attacked or get accused of being spies or get put in internment camps or get murdered in schoolyards. We have hundreds of years of experience with this. And so I think it's just trying to make people aware so that we can try to prevent it. It's not that it's a question. And the only reason why we have the documentation of the 4,000 incidents is because a colleague at San Francisco State, Professor Russell Jung, is a co-founder of StopAAPIHate.org. And he just created this website so people could report it. I mean, there may be millions of cases.
Right.
There may have been thousands and tens of thousands, maybe 1 million last year or the previous years, but no one has bothered to record these before. And so now we have the proof.
Well, that's interesting. And I think you mentioned, before we came on, that there was something similar you wanted to run by Melody. Feel free, now's the time.
Sure. Well, Melody teaches in University of North Carolina, Wilmington, where I used to teach. And when I was living there, there was a really horrible similar mass shooting with a Muslim family in Chapel Hill, in which, again, the media and the killer denied after he did it. Oh, it wasn't Islamophobia. No, it was a parking dispute. But I'll let Melody to talk about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's really sad that we keep seeing, we know that white supremacy is the #1 domestic terrorism threat. And yet there are special laws for people named Muhammad, basically. I mean, there are very special laws for people of color and Muslims in particular. I don't think you can just throw it at Trump. I think you have to throw it at hundreds of years of colonialism. Like, I come from a country that I would not be in this country if the United States did not go to my original country, stage a coup that ultimately led to the so-called Islamic Revolution. So I think America's knowledge of Americans' remembrance is very short. Their memory is so short. Like, that coup in 1953, which wasn't that long ago, would not, there was no reason for us to have this so-called Islamic Revolution in 1979 had they not staged this coup and ousted our democratically elected prime minister, which they did all over Latin America. They did this all over the world. And then you look at them doing it in Latin America, and they've done it. And now people are coming, and there's this, why would people be coming to America? You fucked this country over. And now we owe them reparations as far as I'm concerned. And I think what ends up happening, and not just reparations, in my judgment, I think what they deserve to vote in the United States, because ultimately, Iranians were affected. People from these countries are affected by American presidents. He almost went to war with us, I think, twice. He actually killed one of our leaders. The idea that you can do this and the Iranians get no say in it whatsoever, or people in Latin America get no say in it. And then on top of that, Americans have no idea what the history is. So I think Trump is one thing, but there's so much history that, and you can't even put it just on Democrats or Republicans. If we can unite around one thing, we can unite around this historic, all of these presidents are war criminals. And what they've done is, and I think when we just target one, we forget, and we just passed the anniversary of the Iraq War. How many, people are dying all the time, and Americans aren't really aware of it. And we constantly say things like, this shouldn't happen in America, or this should, as if, and it's funny, but I'm an American. There's nothing special about that. Other people are human beings too. And I think that's sort of what I'm trying to push forward. And I really went off on a serious tangent on top of that, but colonialism gets under my skin. So the history is important, is basically what I'm saying.
Yeah, 100%. And I know like a book that came out recently during Black History Month, 400 Souls, is basically was written out of response of the 1619 Project and covers 400 years basically of oppression and suppression, murders of white Americans to slaves, Black Americans throughout history. So yes, you're right. It is systemic, and but there is that short memory. And going back to the short memory part of it, even just last year during the Black Lives Matter protests, just to me, the classic scenario of, I can't remember which city it was in, where was it in Minnesota, Minneapolis? But there were the protests and some looting. And of course, everybody wants to put the focus on the few looters instead of what the protests are about. And then there was the white gunman walking down the street with, a huge rifle and just able to walk past police officers, and nothing, for the longest, nothing happened. Finally, they approached him. But it's just mind boggling that this happens. Any comments to that? Or Miriam, you were shaking your head earlier. Nia? Jump in.
I was really enthusiastic about everything that Melody was saying, because so frequently when we have these sorts of conversations, we forget, or people forget intentionally to mention imperialism and colonialism. And we live in empire, and empire is toxic. And what she was saying is incredibly important, that white supremacy is both bipartisan and nonpartisan. And white supremacy is foundational to the United States. And until we remove that foundation, we're going to continue to struggle with white supremacy. It's not a fluke. It is one of the primary ingredients of the political institution known as the United States. So I don't know how we can reconstitute the United States without that. I think we need to be reconstituted as something else.
Yeah, great point. Great point. And, back to what we were talking about, the recent hate and violence towards the Asian American communities. I know there's been kind of, when you're combining communities, a little bit of controversy, and I'm hoping Nia and Mei can speak to this, where some business owners in the Asian American community want to ramp up police and security. And obviously that has some concerns within the Black community as far as what's the best way to really deal with this. And so, I want us to be able to, brown and Black communities to kind of rally together and not get divided in these type of things.
If I may answer just quickly, and then I want to hand it to Nia, who the Moab incident just put out a fantastic intersectional statement on, expressing solidarity with Asian Americans and with African Americans. I think this is a media narrative, right? Media narrative says, oh, Asian shopkeepers want more cops. And yet at the same time, they say Asians are victims because Asians won't go to cops, right? So I mean, we're blamed on both for being silent because immigrants are supposedly afraid of the police and for wanting more police. Who is pushing this narrative? It's a media narrative. And secondly, I would just like to say, as many like Red Canary and other community organizations across the nation have pointed out, more policing doesn't necessarily help Asian Americans at all. If we do, in this latest attack on Asian women and Asian women sex workers, People have pointed out, oh my God, cops can be the most toxic people for sex workers because it's criminalized in the United States. There was a very famous case a few years ago of a woman named Yang Song who was one could say, driven to her death by the New York City Police Department. They were pushing her to be an informant. She didn't want to be. She had told her brother in China that she'd been sexually harassed and, in fact, abused by the police officers in New York City. And in a raid in which 5 cars of police were sent to her place of work, she ultimately ended up either falling or jumping to her death rather than being arrested by police officers. So this media-driven narrative that somehow it's Asian shop owners who are calling for the police, I think is false. This is the state, and this is agents of the state who are trying to push us apart. But I'm going to let Nia respond.
Yeah, there's just, I mean, echoing what everyone's been saying, just in the same line of thought, there's just so many elements to this. I think we're talking about media and just some of the headlines I've seen in the last week, which completely deflect away from the actual root of this. Like, as we're talking, these attacks have been just a response to the history of this country. But I mean, I've been seeing headlines that were saying, okay, what can Black people do to support the Asian community, which completely diverts where we should actually be talking. Like, we should be talking about white supremacy. We should be talking about domestic terrorism, despite our communities actually having histories of solidarity. And yet the media often does this to, again, disperse and ignite conflicts between different communities of color. And this is, again, a tactic to actually not get to the root of these problems. And I think, again, to respond to what you were saying, Paula, just bringing up this idea of, in response to violent attacks, then thinking, okay, policing is the solution. And in many cases, we see that actually, antagonizes this even further, just because of the history of policing in this country being originated from slavery and slave catching. There's so much embedded in that just to dissect. But I think in terms of solutions, I think we need to look towards, community care and mutual aid. These are things that I think a lot of communities have been organizing around, especially like in response to attacks. We're not turning towards institutions for our safety. We're looking to each other within our communities. How can we fundraise? How can we put our efforts towards actual organizations that are in the community who have been there to actually support? And so I think it's, again, being able to divest from institutions that actually don't have our support in our best interests, et cetera, and looking to bridge those connections across communities. I think that's essentially what we should be doing and what's extremely important.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, take what you're hearing from the media with a grain of salt, and not look, they're an institution just as much as any other entity, government, or anything else. I mean, they're very much an institution. Social media, we've certainly seen the negative impact like on our elections with certain social media institutions and platforms. And it's about looking inward to communities and bridging that gap within communities. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that's so important. Also, I mean, we can't spend enough time on this because this is so horrific and so recent. And I think we are all feeling it in some ways. But recently in the news as well, and I'm going to put this to you, Miriam, speaking of, it's not about whether it's Democrat or Republican, bipartisan, there's always issues and there's always somebody who needs their feet to the fire. And right now, the Biden administration is getting a lot of flack and being scrutinized regarding deportations, which are increasing border deportations. And obviously, the comeback is that it's new. They inherited this from Trump. They're trying to clean things up from the past administration, which probably some of that is true. But yet this just persists to be a problem that, whether it seems to be Republican or Democrat, they can't seem to get a handle on it. Could you speak to that?
Sure, I can go ahead and speak to that. And before I speak to that issue, I wanted to make two comments in regards to first the critique of media and the role that media is playing in igniting tensions between various minoritized communities. And then I also wanted to comment on policing and misogyny. And one of the things that I wanted to comment on when it comes to media is that media is capitalist, right? So it's driven by capitalism, and capitalism is inherently racialized. So media is going to come down on the side of white supremacy as long as it's driven by racial capitalism. The other thing that I wanted to mention is how incredibly dangerous police are to sex workers and to women at large. Police can use rape as one of their policing techniques when it comes to sex work. They can harm women. That's legally protected. So sexual abuse and rape is commonly perpetrated as part of quote unquote police work. And I think that by and large, I think large swaths of the public do not understand just how dangerous police are to women. And I unfortunately had to learn that firsthand when I experienced domestic violence and made the mistake of reporting that to law enforcement. And I learned firsthand just how incredibly toxic and traumatic engaging with police are. And the police that I engaged with were trained domestic violence detectives who were hideous. So I wanted to emphasize how horrifying the police are, and that the police are somebody that I would advise every woman not to call when she's experienced sexual violence and sexual harm. As far as immigration goes and the argument that Biden is inheriting what some people refer to as a broken system, sure, we can say that Biden inherited a system from Trump, and Trump inherited that system from Obama, and Obama inherited that system from Bush. And it was in 2002 and 2003 that DHS and ICE were formed in response to Islamophobia. So yes, we can say that that's an inheritance, but let's look at the wider scope of inheritance. And like Melody was stating before, this country loves amnesia. This country is filled with amnesiacs, right? Who love to forget. And I think that people use forgetting as a tool of patriotism and a tool of white nationalism. And so Biden definitely ought to be critiqued. And I spoke to some immigration reporters about this issue. And a friend of mine who's an immigration reporter articulated her stance really well, that these administrations, regardless of their partisan shift, are really good at recycling the policies and the leadership from the administration before. If we look at who Biden's transition team is and who was advising him in terms of immigration policy, it was Cecilia Munoz and Amy Pope, who were both advisors to prior administrations. So if Biden is legitimately interested in making a break, why is he tapping into advisors who helped to construct the current detention system in place? It seems that there's not a legitimate interest in doing that. It seems as if there's an interest in perpetuating what was there, but putting a new, happier face on it, a new gloss on it, a new democratic gloss. So I want him to be harshly critiqued.
Yeah. And I mean, on that subject, is there any, what is the best way for our concerns to be heard, to be voiced and heard? Do you have any suggestions? I mean, obviously you have kind of the weapon of writing, but not everybody can use the platforms that you do, that you may have access to. So, I mean, and any one of you answer this when it comes to how we really want to see change, especially with a new administration, before it gets, too deep in perpetuating the same old thing. Do you have suggestions of where do we apply the work? Where is it most productive?
One thing that I would suggest to Americans is to break up with the electoral process. Like like elections do matter to an extent, but when it comes to minoritized people, the largest gains and the biggest improvements that we've seen in our lives typically don't happen through the electoral process. They happen through social movements and social change. So what I would do is I would advise folks who want to see changes made to immigration policy and who want to transform xenophobia, I would advise those folks to determine who's already doing that work on the ground in their community, because they don't need to reinvent the wheel, and work with those folks and understand that this isn't a short game. This is an incredibly long game that you're probably going to be engaged in across your lifespan, and to think in those terms.
Good point. Melody, how about you?
I agree wholeheartedly. And I just want to add, start in your families. I understand not everybody is an activist. And I have had so many people, particularly white people in the South, liberals, come and tell me, I have disowned my racist uncle and they want me to give them a medal. And I'm like, fuck you. Like your Islamophobic uncle is not going to talk to me. But
Right.
he's going to talk to you. So you do that work. Why are you asking me how to solve white supremacy when you're living in a household, you're sitting at a table and you're like, I'm so upset, I'm getting up. Well, how upset do you think I am when your uncle is talking about all these Muslims are terrorists, right? Like, I don't want to talk to your fucking uncle, but you can talk to him. And that's all what I'm saying is start with your families and talk to you. So, and this consistent, like white people asking, how do we solve this problem to people of color? Like, we're not the ones who are going to solve this problem. You are the ones who are going to solve this problem. Mm-hmm. And I think start at your dinner tables. It's that easy. It really is that easy. And when you say, oh, it's so hard for me to deal with my uncle, I don't care. It's harder for me to deal with him.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you point out, it's not up to us to educate. Nia, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I feel like this is a question that I've had to really engage with a lot, or a lot of us have had to engage with it, just as we've seen kind of the uprisings of the last year and even earlier, but just the best, it's always a conversation about what's the best tactic. And I think ultimately it comes down to putting pressure in many different places at once. I think, as you were saying, Melody, everyone isn't an activist, and that's fine. And I think making sure that as long as we're all committed to some sort of change, we can do it effectively in different ways. So there is a lot of value in the pressure that social movements and protests and uprisings have. There is value to some of the changes that do happen on an electoral level. There's impact that happens in the classroom, in the ways that we're teaching curriculum, the ways we're acknowledging this country's history, doing it in family spaces or spaces with friends and community building. So I think it really is about spreading our techniques wide and being able to reflect and know, okay, what are my strengths? The people in my network, what are our strengths collectively? How can we continue to educate each other, support each other, and push for change in many different facets?
Yeah. You agree with that, Maylee?
I was just going to jump in and say, I agree with what everyone has said. Paula, this is such a great panel. it's so healing to be here in this space. Melody, Myriam, Nia, thank you so much. All of these techniques are awesome. You know, like with Fair Fight, who I know Paula chose to sponsor today for funding support. You know, if we didn't have the Senate, we wouldn't have a chance, right? Because we do have to vote, because otherwise they can kill us all. They can just round us up and kill us all. We've seen that. So we've got to fight at that front, but also speaking up at the dinner table, speaking up at friends. You know, people make a racist joke, please don't laugh along, right? You know, it just seems like such a small thing. When I was growing up in South Dakota, I had school teachers who would just do like this horrible, inept stand-up routine in the front of the class, and they would just say horrific racial jokes, ethnic jokes, sexist jokes, homophobic jokes, and, you know, everyone's supposed to just laugh along. Otherwise, you're branded as the, you know, the freak or the nerd. Or I'm like, well, you know, I'm fine being the freak. I will wear that. I will fly that flag proudly. There's a lot of peer pressure to conform, and we all can do our part to speak up and not to conform to this culture that accommodates white supremacy and capitalist white supremacy. We've had a lot of discussions in social media about Hollywood and the horrific images that are constantly perpetuated at the highest platform, not just for us, but throughout the world. How does America spread white supremacy? Through our movies, through our entertainment. And so, you know, we can speak up about that too, because this is what's so toxic, is we export white supremacy as a culture.
Wow, what a great point. That's so true, so true. And I know, you know, there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical, especially after what happened this last time with our electoral process, and definitely needs reform. Absolutely. But it's definitely not going anywhere. And it's the system that we have to work with on a larger level. And obviously we saw the work that like Stacey Abrams did in Georgia make a big difference. And I was kind of surprised when I was doing some research, Melody, to find out that a surprising amount of Muslims did vote in favor of Trump, which obviously people can vote whoever they want to vote for. But I guess because of a lot of the anti-Muslim rhetoric that came from him during his tenure, I just was a little surprised. Were you, or is that just kind of like, you know, not a monolithic group of people, so it's going to happen? And I just wonder, on that larger scale, how do we come together?
Yeah, I mean, I know of one, but apart from that, I mean, I'm sure some people did, and I mean, that's going to happen within every community. And I don't know how to defend the entire Muslim community.
Yeah, and I wouldn't expect you to. Yeah,
yeah,
you know, it's kind of like, you know, as someone was saying, and it may have been Stacey Abrams, that if people aren't getting educated about the vote or encouraged to get out the vote, or feel like they're voting in a fair and secure election, then there's just the suppression of it. So sometimes it's not a matter that they are voting for somebody as much as they're just not participating because they've been discouraged.
Yeah, there is a factor of like wanting, so this whiteness is a construct, right? So like Muslims want in, right? And Muslims are black, white, brown, of every race. The majority of Muslims are absolutely not Middle Eastern like me. The majority are African and Asian. I'm technically Asian, so West Asian. But that's not, this mentality that we think all Muslims are from one place isn't true. This, so there's that. And I think what's happening is you have groups of immigrants that want in on the American dream. And the way to get in on it is for them, that's what they see is, okay, let's copy this. And let's get this whiteness. Like the census still won't give us a Middle East, North Africa category, right? And they advise Middle Easterners to check white, right? I always check Asian because technically I'm in that continent, but what if you're from Libya, right? Like I don't see that as being a good offering, but at the same fucking time, I'm not going to check Middle East. Like my parents are not going to check Middle East, North African. What? You're going to like collect this list to collect that, like to round us up, which is genuinely a fear. We saw what they did to the Japanese. Like this isn't something that they can't do to us. And I think what we need, and coming back to what we were talking earlier about, is that it's easy to like get lost in this like specific identity politics. And we have to realize that we rely on one another. And not only do we rely on one another, like all my friends are married to other people. So like, what are you going to do with the Iranian, Ethiopian American kid, right? Like how does the Iranian, Ethiopian American kid grow up? And that like, what country does Keon get? Right? This is my friend's son. He's 2. Like he's not even 2. But like, what does he get? And I think there's a lot of people like that who are going to help change things, but we can't rely on them. And I think this is where white people need to realize that if you have that privilege, if you've been given entry into this myth of whiteness, then fucking do something with it and stop asking us what to do with it. I know I keep harping on that, but I've noticed a bunch of questions in the chat along those lines.
Oh yeah, thanks for noticing that. Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, it's like you're constantly having to remind people, no, it's not our job to educate you. Yeah. I remember having in the throes of the Black Lives Matter movement protests last year, someone actually called me up or texted me, white colleague or friend, and said, I'm tired of arguing with my husband and trying to explain everything. Will you come over? And I was just like, no, no, it's no, I can't even believe you're asking me that. I was like, you do the work. You're both intelligent people. You do the work, And so, yeah, it's a response. Learning and changing and growing is everybody's individual responsibility, but certainly within the white community, it's a responsibility. Yeah. Me, I see. Do you have it?
I would just say, like, I would absolutely resonate with that. I think it is a responsibility of everyone. And it is challenging. I think sometimes we are in those positions where we have close relationships with people. We've built trust and they look to us because we are that entry point. And so it is a balance of, again, capacity of knowing, like, can I share some of my information or access or experiences, but ultimately being able to do so with the onus on the other person to take whatever information and do the work themselves. I also just wanted to say, I know Miriam was about to say something, so I want to give that space to her too.
Thank you. I wanted to add to what Melody was saying about whiteness, that whiteness is mutable and white supremacy exists everywhere. So white folks are going to be the people who elasticize whiteness and decide who to let into the fold. And they're going to offer crumbs to people of color as they bring people of color into the fold and whiten them, so to speak. So whitening is a process. And there is a projected date in the United States at which white people are no longer going to be in the majority, and white people are already sort of trying to dynamically alter the parameters of whiteness in order to continue to maintain their hegemony. And so white people are going to appeal to various different groups, right? They're going to appeal to Arabs, they're going to appeal to Latinos, they're going to appeal to any group that can transform itself and obey whiteness and uphold whiteness. And there was like a large faction of Latino men who voted for Trump, because machismo appeals to them and white supremacy appeals to them. And if you look at who the foot soldiers of ICE are, ICE is overwhelmingly Mexican American. And Mexico is a white supremacist settler colonial state as well. And this is something that's often left out of conversations about Mexico. So I wanted to offer that as well and say that, like, within these minoritized communities, you have folks who are also clamoring for whiteness and who are clamoring for these crumbs that are thrown to them because they feel that they don't have access to the cake. So they'll take those crumbs from the cake.
So it's aspirational.
I'd also like to add that propaganda on behalf of white supremacy is very good. It's very sophisticated. By good, I mean sophisticated and ubiquitous, right? I mean, Trump is not a successful businessman. He was a failed businessman, 11 bankruptcies. I mean, the rest of us would be we wouldn't even be homeless, would be dead, would be, constantly imprisoned for, our debts. But, because Hollywood made him into the boss on The Apprentice who fires people, they made him look competent. So a lot of struggling people will vote against their best interests because the propaganda said, look, this is what competence is. And they want to side with that because it feels like, a safety line, right? They're struggling for things. So I think that this is where I'm going to speak up for artists and poets and the writers. It's like, this is where we can counter the propaganda, right? Because that kind of propaganda is what it is. It's very broad, but it can also be very crude. So like, we can sustain ourselves and our communities and be that healing space with art. So that people who are so marginalized and desperate don't go looking for these crumbs and swallow this Hollywood propaganda. That's why I feel like I really love MOAD, for example, the Museum of the African Diaspora, because you have such really beautiful and empowering exhibits. I think about an exhibit I went to with a friend a few years ago on the Black Panthers, and it talked about the breakfast programs for children. It talked about all the community works, and like, who wouldn't want to join that? It was so beautiful in these pictures. And I think about, instead, there's a recent Hollywood movie, I won't name it because I don't want to like diss on the actors who were superb, but it was all about toxic masculinity and guns and men fighting, and like the one woman who gets a speaking part is there to get pregnant. And I'm like, this is what Hollywood tells us the Black Panthers are about, but MOAD tells us a very different story. And I think this is what we as artists can do. We can tell a different story.
Yeah, which is a good point of how people can do the work and be educated, is to take advantage of art. Take advantage, because we learn through art and poetry and writing and books. Obviously, we all want to uplift books, and that's as accessible as, the family dinner conversations, or maybe the family and friends, and your friends have maybe more diversity to add to a conversation. And I do want to get in some questions from the audience. And that's why I'm looking down. I'm looking at them from my phone. Question from Cindy. What can we do as Asian Americans to combat these media narratives? I think because maybe you were talking about the media narratives.
Well, one thing is just continually speak up and say the media narrative is false. And this can be, like speaking up in a big way in our art, or just speaking up in conversation with friends or in a classroom, or even within family, because family members can swallow that media narrative as well. So there's small ways and there's large ways. And unfortunately, it's exhausting because sometimes it's constant, but there are a multitude of ways. And then I just want to let Nia speak, because I know you had your hand up earlier. So if you wanted to say something.
Sure. I mean, just to go back to what you had said when you had briefly mentioned MOAD, I think that is at the root of what we're doing. We're making sure that it's not just one narrative that's being told. I think because MOAD's focus is contemporary art of the diaspora, it's inherently global. And so we've featured exhibitions from literally all around the world, from living Black artists from around the world. And so I think that's hugely important, that it's not just focusing on history, that we're saying, we're alive and we're doing all of these impactful things. We're using our art and our platforms to tell our stories. And so I think that work is extremely important, as you were saying, as artists. We have to continue to take up space and say that we're here and we exist because of our histories, but we also are here creating new ones. So I just wanted to thank you also for giving that shout out to MOAD, and encourage folks that if you do want to engage and do the work through our programming, through exhibitions, it's a great place to start. And
art is just a fun place to start, right? Like, it's affirming. It doesn't, like, this work of fighting anti-white, fighting anti-racism and fighting against white supremacy, it doesn't always have to be like eating gruel. Sometimes, like this week was definitely an eating gruel week. It was a hell week. But going to MOAD and other, museums that center BIPOC artists, women who are, artists who are typically marginalized from that capitalized mainstream, right? That can be a very healing and empowering space, and help build community.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely a good point. We say do the work, but it doesn't have to feel like work all the time, which is fine. Just that you're learning and you're changing. Miriam, I have a question for you, if you don't mind. It's related to American Dirt. Do you mind addressing that? What would be, this is from Angela, and she's asking, what would be a good companion book, I guess, if a book group chooses American Dirt to read? And she also wants to know, do you still feel as strongly against American Dirt as you did last year?
Well, I wouldn't advise that anybody match a companion to that book. There's no reason to read that book if people want to educate themselves on immigration. If people want to read a thriller that cannibalizes racialized trauma for cheap thrills, then go ahead, by all means, read American Dirt, but don't read it to educate yourself about immigration in the global South. It's not going to do that. It represents itself, and it was marketed as social realism, but it is chock full of harmful stereotypes, and it misrepresents the United States as a haven for migrants, as opposed to the xenophobic cesspool that it actually is. So I would.
You're answering the second part of that question already.
Yeah. So when Janine Cummins initially published American Dirt, in her acknowledgement section, she listed various books that she used in order to shape her narrative. For example, she referenced Devil's Highway by Luis Alberto Urrea. She referenced, I believe, a book by Reina Grande. She referenced books by Sonia Nazario. I would recommend that if a person wanted to learn about immigration, that they read those authors, and that more importantly, they not learn about immigration through fiction, that they actually follow immigration reporters who are reporting on reality and not writing thrillers. And yes, I continue to feel as strongly as I did initially, but I'd also like to state that I didn't tell people that they should wholly turn away from American Dirt. When I wrote my review, I said that it was a perfect read for a self-righteous gringa book club. So if that is your book club, then that is the book for you.
Yeah, all good points. Thank you. And I think it's also important to add that not only did she reference some of those great books that we recommend, but she actually lifted some of that.
Yeah, there's a scene that is set in a garbage dump in Tijuana that appears in Luis Urrea's earlier work. And the scene is very similar. And Cummins lists that work in her acknowledgements, and Urrea was very disturbed to encounter that that piece of I'll call it a borrowed scene. It did bother him quite a bit.
Yeah. Nia, I have a question. Someone has a question from you. It looks like this is from Anne, and she just wants to know, what do you think the next steps are for the Black Lives Matter movement? Where do they go from here? How do they stay relevant and effective?
That's a big question.
Yeah, right.
I think it always will be relevant until that statement actually lives out in this country and also globally. I think we will continue to say Black Lives Matter because, as we know, until one of us is free, all of us will be free. And so I think what I'm seeing recently is actually calls for some leaders or people who have been involved with Black Lives Matter to actually step down from their podiums. These are specific leaders who are kind of use the movement as a way for their own, whether it's fame or their own kind of individual benefits. And so these are, I don't know all the names of the people who are being asked to step down, but I think it actually speaks to the importance of decentralizing movements in general. We see that oftentimes there's multiple things that happen when you have figureheads of movements. Either they are, the prime targets of government attacks and assassinations in attempts to quell a movement, or you have the case where those people then turn that spotlight for their own purposes. So I think it really speaks to what we've been talking about the importance of movement building on a community level and among your peers. So I think Black Lives Matter, again, will continue to be relevant. And I think the way forward is through our community building on a local level and making sure that we also are listening to the people who are directly impacted by that and continuing to center them. A lot of the requests for leaders to step down from their positions are actually coming from mothers of victims of police brutality. They're the ones saying, you know, we have not been heard in these movements, and these movements are about our sons, our daughters, our family. And so I think that's going to be extremely important to continue making sure those are the voices that are heard as we move forward.
Yeah, I think as long as there's racism, there's a need for that movement. And it's also important to note that it didn't just happen after George Floyd was murdered. They had actually been up and running for a few years. It's just that it came to more prominence and more, you know, I think because we were all kind of shut down, and people who maybe would have never noticed them before had nothing else to do, and they were horrified with George Floyd's murder and noticed what kind of the prominence that was coming to BLM. But they weren't new then, and they're not going away because racism isn't going away. Let me see. Last one from the audience. This is from Morrissey Carroll. If media covers for some white offenders and prosecutes some BIPOC victims, who's the audience for that?
Well, as Miriam, I'll just say, as Miriam says, drama sells, right?
Yeah.
You know, drama sells. And so when you heighten the conflict, and, you know, you pit groups against each other and you repeat certain tropes, it's a time-honored narrative, and it's a way to simplify and to heighten conflict, and people tune in. And if these are the only platforms that people can see, you know, on certain, like the cable networks, then that's all you get to see. So then, I mean, and who is the real audience? I would say it's maybe the owners, right? The owners of these newspapers, it's the owners of the cable networks, because that's where the profits are coming from. They don't really want to see grassroots social change.
So no more questions at this point. So before we totally leave, I had told my panelists that they would have an opportunity before we all left to maybe give a quick book recommendation and uplift a particular indie bookstore that either carries their books, because they all have books, and I have a feeling I know what bookstore Nia is going to talk about. But yeah, let's uplift independent bookstores that are promoting your works and other valid and wonderful writers. Nia, why don't I start with you?
Wonderful. Well, I'm extremely biased because I work at MOAD and we have a bookstore which I run. So I would encourage people to not only support MOAD for our programs, but also our bookstore. It is specifically dedicated as a platform for Black authors to exclusively sell books by Black authors from around the world. It was really hard. Paula asked me to come up with a book recommendation. I was like, well, I run a bookstore. How can I just pick one book to recommend? So I'll share like 2, maybe 3 books that we have carried at MOAD. First would be The Three Mothers. It's a new book that just came out in February by Anna Malika Tubbs, and it's about the mothers of Martin Luther King, James Baldwin, and Malcolm X. And it's a beautiful historic look at their lives, focusing how we even got these leaders that are figureheads. What is the family backstory behind that? So I would entirely recommend that book. I also just recently listened to Cast by Isabel Wilkerson on audiobook. That I think is also an essential read when thinking about history and racism, not only in the US, but also across the world. Definitely a recommended read. And then also How We Get Free, which is Black feminism and the Combahee River Collective. So I think those 3 will set you up for a good start.
Great. Myriam, you've got a couple and then a bookstore?
So I'll start with the bookstore and then I'll talk about the book. So in the spirit of keeping things very local, there is a bookstore right down the street from me called Page Against the Machine. And Page Against the Machine is is super cool. It's really small. They have like a really, really eclectic selection of books, and it's a very fun place to go browse. And Page Against the Machine is also committed to nurturing the community and also functions and doubles as an art space. So I urge everybody to go there. And when it comes to book picks, I would like to promote Rhonda Girard's book, which is titled Love is an Ex-Country. And that is a memoir that that chronicles Rhonda's life as a person who's essentially living in exile. She is the daughter of a Palestinian who was largely raised in the United States. And she chronicles her life as an artist and dissident in that work. And it's incredibly gorgeous and beautiful.
Thank you. Melody?
Sorry. Pomegranate Books is the bookstore here in Wilmington where I am. I'd also like to give a shout out to Karis Books in Atlanta. I lived in Atlanta for about a decade. It's a feminist bookstore that was always really supportive of me. A lot of great ones here in North Carolina, quite honestly. So in terms of books, yeah, so I'm gonna take a cue from Myriam and promote somebody. There's a Iranian Argentinian American young adult fiction writer who has a book coming out in May called Perfectly Pavine. You can pre-order it. It's May 18th it comes out. And if you pre-order it, you get a free sheet of lavash, which is like this delicious sour fruit leather that we eat in Iran. And on the line of food, to also recommend like the quintessential Persian cookbook is called Food of Life by Najmeh Batmangali. So I highly recommend that. She's written a ton of books, including a vegetarian Iranian cookbook, which I didn't even realize existed, but it does. It exists. And there's newer ones, but she's the queen of Iranian cooking in English here.
And Mei Li?
The bookstore is East Wind Books of Berkeley, and it is just a fabulous independent bookstore run by a mom pop organization, Bea and Arthur Dong. They've been very involved with community and with the civil rights movement, very intersectional. They're really a Bay Area institution. And for a title, I'm choosing Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu. And this won the National Book Award this past year in fiction. And this shows that fighting racism and white supremacy does not have to be like eating gruel. This is a very playful book. It takes on Hollywood stereotypes, but it's also very informative. And I think it's a work of genius. And then also a short novella I'm going to recommend, When the Emperor Was Divine by Julie Otsuka. And that's set in the Bay Area, in the Berkeley area. It's about a Japanese American family who were sent to an internment camp. And it's just beautiful, beautiful writing. So again, this is a work of art that is inspiring. It's, deeply moving, and it's a pleasure to read.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning Interior Chinatown, one of my favorites of last year. It's brilliant. You will get hit hard with the poignancy as much as you will laugh out loud. It's just brilliant. So thanks for that recommendation. All your recommendations, thank you. They're going to be on the Book Passage website. And as a shout out to bookstores, obviously I have to give a shout out to Book Passage that co-sponsored this event. Thank you very much. I also would like to say Underground Books in Sacramento and Café Con Libros in Brooklyn, which is a feminist bookstore and minority owned. So now I'm going to ask for Julie to come back on. Hey, Julie, where are you? You there? There you are.
Wow. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Paula, and all of our wonderful panelists for hosting this honest, open, incredibly healing discussion. that encourages all of us to stay strong and brave and to use our platform, whether it's at the dinner table or in front of a huge audience, to use our voice, use our platform, use our courage to continue fighting the good fight and getting us to a more just and, you know, a more just and beloved community. Want to remind everyone that today we are supporting Fair Fight. We want to combat voter suppression. So go to the link on the screen that you're viewing in, or go to fairfight.com. And all of our panelists' book recommendations you will be able to find on the Book Passage website. So thank you everyone for joining us. Again, thank you, Paula, our panelists, Zach and Nick, and for everyone that helped make this event happen. Thank you.